Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really, truly delighted to be here. Um, I will, uh, I will be very happy to share some work that Danny Roderick and I did for originally President Macron of France, but that we have expanded to other countries. And the overarching goal is to think about inequality and economic insecurity jointly and think about a policy agenda for inclusion. Um, so one thing that you have probably heard of multiple times during this conference and in general is this structural problem, which is a lack of good jobs. So this is really a fundamental problem today, the failure to really produce a good number of basically good jobs that can sustain a prosperous and growing middle class. And there's many quantitative indicators you can see of this. This is something you see, for instance, reflected in measures of labor market polarization, when there is some high-skilled jobs, some sort of lower-skilled jobs that require less training, but then there's a gap that's forming in the middle. You can also see it in rising spatial inequality between regions. That's happening in many countries. You can see it in declining job stability, a higher turnover where people change jobs and firms more often. And you can see it in greater self-reported economic insecurity, if you use surveys, if you look at what people think. And then overall, more broadly, this is also reflected in declining income shares of the middle class. If we look at the share of all income that goes to various groups, there is clearly a decline in what is going to a broad range of middle class households. And these causes are secular. These are not short-term trends by any means. Two of the fundamental causes here are globalization and technological change. But I would also add a third one for some countries. It's more relevant in some places than others, which is institutional changes like the decline of unionization and organized labor movements. So these are really structural trends that are not necessarily going away anytime soon. And these trends really create a rift, a gap between those that can benefit from them, which is usually people who live in metropolitan areas with quote unquote the right skills, and those who are left behind. And one question you may ask is, what are actually good jobs? I mean, this is a term we use a lot that we mention without necessarily defining it. So we actually tried to ask people in various countries, what are good jobs to them? And this is something that I do a lot at my lab at Harvard, the social economics lab, where we run surveys to really understand how people think and reason about economic and policy issues that sometimes deeply affect their lives. And a good job, if you pool the responses and look across countries, is a job that provides first a high enough wage to afford decent living conditions. Some have called this a living wage, but it goes beyond that. It's for good living conditions. It also provides some social benefits. It's a job that provides a reasonable level of personal autonomy. It's a job that has adequate economic security, which means some stability, and then some opportunities as well for career progression. So these are sort of the main ingredients that come up a lot when people are asked to define what a good job is to them. And some of the terms, specifically that people mention when they talk about a good job are, reflective of these factors, like a good salary, a good environment, good work conditions, career progression, etc. And sadly, another finding in these surveys is that just around 50% of respondents think that their job, their work, is at least as good as that of their parents when they were the same age. So there is certainly no generalized notion that things are improving relative to the previous generation. And another interesting fact is that only half of all respondents believe that there are good jobs available where they live, so that they could potentially find a job without having to move. So what are the consequences? Why do we even worry about this lack of good job? Well, first, there's obviously very big indirect consequences on the labor market and on the people who are affected, the workers. That's very much the direct cost, and that's potentially, very big. But it actually goes beyond that in terms of indirect costs. So what are those indirect costs? Well, this is something that many researchers have looked at across fields like economics and sociology and political science. So there's social costs that have been documented. So for instance, a breakdown of family structures, drug abuse, substance abuse, as well as crime, have all been linked to a lack of good jobs in an area or for particular people. There's also political costs. We're witnessing in many places a rise in authoritarian, ethno-nationalist populism and political polarization, which, as documented again by a lot of research, could partially be traced back to these economic conditions. And then finally, there's economic costs to a lack of good jobs. Namely, when we think about new technologies like automation, the knowledge economy, or digital advances, we would ideally like these innovations to spread throughout the economy. But when there is such a lack of good jobs, many of these great technologies remain sort of bottled up in a few firms, in a few sectors, among some selected group of workers, and don't really disseminate down to everyone else and improve overall productivity by the creation of more productive jobs in sort of the middle of the income and skill distribution. So there is no huge benefit to the economy as a whole the way it could be. So these are indirect costs in addition to the direct costs to people that really make us want to think, what can we do to resolve this problem? And so there is obviously a lot of scope for public intervention, by which I mean governments, because these economic, political, and social costs, they're not necessarily taken into account when firms make their production and their investment decisions. So it's true that there's a lot of research showing that good firms provide good jobs. There is a correlation between the quality of the firm in terms of productivity, management, and the quality of jobs that it generates. That is certainly true. And many firms, do have social concerns in the sense that they also want to take decisions which are good for society or the environment. So there are clearly, motives beyond just profits. But in general, typically businesses will mainly invest in good jobs to the extent it's good for business. But as we just saw, the benefit of good jobs to society extend way beyond that. And this is what we economists call externalities and spillovers. When firms decide what production decisions to take, what hiring decisions to make, or innovation to undergo, they don't necessarily take into account all these broader political, social, economic costs. So this opens up the scope for public intervention to internalize these spillovers, to sort of make firms really confront the true, if you want, costs of their decisions and their actions, but also the true benefits of, say, creating more good jobs. And so businesses really have a very important role to play, but this has to be done in coordination with governments and public policy. This is not a problem that only the private market alone can resolve. And so how we think about this is actually best explained with this matrix here. So let me tell you a bit of a framework that is very useful to think about public policy intervention. So what do you see on this matrix? So first, you have these columns that represent the stage of the economy at which the policy intervenes. So first, we have this pre-production stage. What is that? Think of this as everything that happens before you enter the labor market. This would be acquiring education and training. So this is everything that makes people acquire the skills, the productive resources in order to enter the labor market. Then we have this second column, which is the production stage. So this is actually where production happens, the labor market, interactions between firms and employees, etc. And then we have the post-production stage. So this is what happens after you've received your income. There's still things that happen. For instance, there's shocks like unemployment, like health shocks, retirement, possible health and disability issues. And so the post-production stage is all the government intervention that happens to redistribute incomes, for instance, through progressive taxes, and to insure you against shocks like health, old age, or disability. We also have rows in this matrix. So these rows tell us at which income segment does the intervention happen, or which group are we targeting here. And you can think about sort of the bottom incomes, so lower income people, a middle class chunk, and then the top incomes. So different policies will be targeting different groups here. And we can look at a few examples. So if I populate this based on examples from several countries, it's heavy on European country examples here, but it's in general also valid, for many rich countries. In the pre-production stage, something that is targeting in general bottom incomes in terms of being extremely useful is primary education, early childhood programs, vocational training. We have public higher education, adult retraining programs. And then at the top incomes, for instance, one example of a policy that affects the resources we bring into the labor market are inheritance and estate taxes. They're a way to redistribute financial capital, among younger people, among children, before they enter the labor market. In the production stage, again, we have a range of interesting policies here, including more regulatory policies like the minimum wage, but also innovation policies, R&D policies, trade policy, anything related to active labor market policies. So relations between the government and firms, or the government and people in their role as workers. And then in the post-production stage, we have our sort of core progressive welfare state policies like social transfers for family, for housing, for children, guaranteed minimum incomes, unemployment insurance, and then a progressive tax system like top income tax rates, and in some countries, wealth taxes. And if we think about the core traditional welfare state, as was the case in many rich countries, the traditional welfare state was very focused on this first and third pillar. So it was a setting in which there was a lot of progressive taxation and transfers, and at the same time, a lot of investment in education. So these were really the core pillars that were there. But this has limits, because if we think about this traditional welfare system, it is very much a model that assumes, as long as we invest enough in education for everyone will be able to find a good job. And so really all we have to then do is to focus on, buffering shocks or redistributing income in the third pillar. So really the focus was on social spending on education, and then social insurance against idiosyncratic risks. So this is really the pre-production and post-production policies in terms of the matrix I just showed you. And these production stage policies, these middle pillar policies that I showed you, they were typically not considered an integral part of the welfare state. There were some exceptions like the minimum wage, collective bargaining regulations, or labor protections. But in general, the idea was these middle policies in the middle pillar, they should be concerned with market competition, with physical or capital investment, and with R&D. So in a sense, there was this separation between, on the one hand, social policies, the policies that focus on inequality and insecurity, and on the other hand, economic policies that focus on productivity, innovation, and growth. And this separation makes a lot of sense in a world where good jobs are available to everyone, or to most people, like was probably the case for many decades, or at least was much more the case for many decades, but it's definitely not the case today. And given that today inequality and insecurity are these structural problems which cause an inadequacy of good jobs and middle-class jobs, we see this hollowing out of the employment distribution in the middle. And so we have this structural problem that exhibits itself as a sort of permanent form of bad jobs and depressed regional labor markets. So we need a very different strategy to tackle this. We can't just tackle it by providing more education or redistributing incomes and providing social insurance. And so really what we're arguing for is that because of these important structural changes, we do need productivity, innovation, and growth policies that look more like social policies, and vice versa. So in a sense here, the growth and inequality agendas have to go hand in hand, and need to merge. And so this is really what we're proposing in this in this line of work is to have a good jobs welfare state model, which in addition to, these first and third pillar, where we make some key recommendations listed here, and I'll talk about all of them, we're also adding this middle, circle about production stage policies that should very much also be used to address inequality and insecurity. So on this matrix, you see a bit the snapshot of all the policies we're thinking about in detail, ranging from education policies to tax policies to competition policies. But I'll cover a few in the second part now of the talk, going in detail into some of the proposals here. So let's start with the first pillar, so pre-production policies. Here, what I do want to cover is this issue of inheritance, estate, and gift taxation. So what are these taxes? So these are taxes which, take different names in different countries, but these are taxes on transmissions between generations. So some countries, like France, for instance, has an inheritance tax and also a gift tax, which means you are taxing the transfers that go from the parents' generation to the heirs, which could be their direct children, but could also be other relatives or unrelated people. A country like the US has an estate tax, which is a bit different. It's almost like a wealth tax, which is paid once, at death. It's basically paid on the total wealth of the deceased person. But all of these taxes are basically taxes to reduce the persistence of wealth across generations. And there's a lot of evidence that wealth inequality is rising in many countries, although this is something that is particularly hard to study because we typically don't have very good wealth data. But these are also very unpopular taxes. So I have done some work, and other people have too, to try and see how citizens in several countries understand these taxes, how they work, who actually gains or loses from them. And we can see a very big misunderstanding in terms of who actually pays these. So for instance, in the US, people tend to think that around 1/3 of all households will pay the estate tax. The reality is less than 1 in 1,000. So there's a very big estimation of how many households are actually affected by the estate tax. And so what we're thinking about here is this idea that in current systems, what's happening is that a lot of the transfers get missed by the tax authorities, especially transfers that come from wealthier families that have a long horizon and are able to optimize the transfers properly through time and through proper design. So instead, what we really are arguing for is actually a proposal that was originally done by Tony Atkinson. And, a version of it is done in Ireland currently, which is a beneficiary-based regime. So everything is counted for a person who receives the transfers. For them, all the transfers that are received will be added throughout their life, regardless of when they're received and regardless of who they get it from. So if I get something from my mother, and then I get something from my great aunt with 20 years apart, this will all be added. This is all the total transfers I've received. And then we can have a proper progressive scheme on that total that is received. This ensures that you can do two things. One is that if a person is receiving transfers from different sources or at different points in time, you will not forget about them. It won't be a myopic system like is currently the case in many places. Instead, everything will be added because this is total money you received in your life. In addition, it allows us to have true progressivity. Instead of taxing transfer by transfer, which means that in the end, you are penalizing people who are, transferring modest amounts and favoring people who can stagger a lot of wealth in different timing, you can actually have a truly progressive system where you may want to exempt a lot of the sort of middle class transfers and then have very progressive rates at the top. So this is something that's an important discussion in many countries, given this rise in wealth inequality and the need to reduce the persistence of wealth across generations. In the second pillar is perhaps some of the meatiest policy proposals. So this is really our idea of sort of good job policies that we can do. And really this is the case where there's typically perceived to be a trade-off between sort of better working conditions and unemployment. So for instance, people tend to point to youth unemployment in many countries like France or Spain and saying, well, if we try to, create better jobs for some, this will actually mean more unemployment for others. And this is definitely true if there is no associated productivity growth. So if we are just, trying to improve working conditions without actually improving productivity, then this is likely going to be a very harsh trade-off. But the idea here is to really have good job creation combined with a wider dissemination of technologies and policies and, creation of good firms that create good jobs. So really, this is the idea of these proposals here, is not just to, improve the quality of existing jobs, but actually do try to create better jobs. And so here's some elements that we're thinking about. There's really four policies I'll talk about, four types of policies. So it's active labor market policies linked to employers. It's industrial and regional policies that target good jobs explicitly. It's innovation policies. This is a little bit unusual and new, so we can talk about this. Innovation policies that are directed towards labor-friendly technologies. And then it's international economic policies, particularly, say, trade policy, that actually tries to protect domestic labor and social standards. And they're all very much connected by a common objective, which is creating good jobs. But another thing we discussed is actually the importance of essentially a bit of a new form of governance, which means a collaboration, an iteration, an experimental agreement between the private and the state actors, where there is more communication and coordination. There's, incentives provided to businesses in exchange for good jobs with a really quid pro quo, as well as, a better experimentation, a better study and evaluation of what's actually happening in real time on the ground. And so let's start with this first group of policies in the middle pillar, which is employer-focused active labor market policies. So active labor market policies have a mixed record. There's a lot of studies of them, and they have been around for a very long time. So typically there's different versions of it, like skill training and certification, employment subsidies, public sector work programs, and then assistance with job search and matching. It's typically done through public employment services. And so this has a mixed record where, for instance, skill training and certification has a better track record in several countries, according to research. Others have a bit more of a mixed results. In the US, there's something very interesting that we sort of take as a bit of an example, which is what's called sectoral training programs. So those are programs which happen in several states and actually in several sectors, where there's a very good coordination between local employers' needs and local organizations or local governments. So what is done in these programs is that there's a very close cooperation where employers will express the needs. For instance, we need people of this type of skill with these type of certifications, and they are involved in the curriculum design of the training. And the training includes, not just sort of hard skills, also soft skills. And then communities, organizations, or local governments, provide this sort of training to people. In exchange, companies commit to hiring these people in good conditions, at good wages, and to allow these people to be tracked once they're employed by the organization, so that we can make sure this is working, these people are well paid, these people are receiving, the good working conditions they were promised. So one example that has been extensively studied is Project Quest in San Antonio, Texas, which is geared towards the healthcare sector, where there's very big needs, and where basically local communities are training people to become healthcare workers. And the results are pretty good in terms of getting hired, receiving a good wage for an extended period of time. There's these sort of initiatives that pop up in the fully private sector. For instance, Google has a very large scale training program for coding skills and other tech skills that I think is currently about to graduate or will be graduating 1 million people. So it is a very large scale endeavor to try and provide, skills that employers need. The second big type of policy in this middle pillar is business incentives or regional policies that are very much focused on good jobs. So a lot of the policies today, when we think about business incentives, they typically take the form of subsidies or help for physical investment and new technologies. So one example is tax breaks that are given to companies that come and locate in a given city or in a given state or in a given country. So this is happening a lot. For instance, when Amazon was choosing where to put, its headquarters, many places raced to give Amazon tax breaks and perks in order to attract it to locate there. And there's a lot of research to study how well do these incentives work, especially these tax incentives to attract businesses. And they do work. They do attract businesses. Businesses are sensitive to these tax incentives. However, if people try to estimate, well, what is the job creation that results from this, especially locally, and what is the cost per job created, it turns out to be very high. This is a very costly way because it is subsidizing, physical capital investments and typically new technologies rather than specifically employment. It's actually a costly way to create good jobs and maybe also a bit more indirect. So these policies can have their use, but if the goal is to create jobs and good jobs particularly, this may not be the most direct way. And so Tim Bartik at the Upjohn Institute has done this very interesting work to study these business incentives and also provide ideas of what to do better given on what works. And his ideas are, first of all, incentives, so providing tax breaks or subsidies really have to be focused on areas that are distressed. So these have to be used sparingly and really in areas that need them instead of all over the place. Second, the policies really need to center around sectors or firms that do have the potential to actually create jobs. Not all sectors or firms can do that. And so if you're constrained in public funds, perhaps the higher value use is exactly towards those centers who can potentially create those jobs. The other thing is that tax incentives should not be the only tool and maybe not even the main tool. They're a costly way, as we said, to create good jobs. Instead, the focus could be on providing specific services that firms do need, like customized business services, zoning and infrastructure policies. These are things firms do need to operate well in a given place. Local amenities, and of course, skills training, which leads back to the first type of policy on active labor market policies in coordination with local employers. So it's a bit more of a service package for firms rather than just, say, tax incentives. That could be a more effective way to really target the creation of good jobs. The third type of policy in the second middle pillar that we talk about is innovation policies that are directed towards labor-friendly technologies. So what do we mean by this? This is a little bit unusual. Typically the stance is what I put here in the first bullet in quotation marks, which is, well, technology is rapidly changing, and the skills you need to operate these technologies are changing as well. And so what we need to do, or what workers need to do, is they need to adjust through better education and continuous training. That is the typical stance. And, in many cases, this does make sense, but it does treat technology as this, exogenous, almost magical force that happens without us having any influence on it. And this is not true. So a lot of research shows that innovation is not a magical activity. It is very much an economic activity that responds to incentives. When inventors choose which field to work in, which country to work in, which sector to work in, they are very much taking into account, of course, their passion, their scientific interest, but also the economic incentives and the financial setting. And this has been shown, in many, many countries over long periods of time. And so really technology is something that does respond to incentives. It responds to R&D tax credits. It responds to taxes on capital and labor. It responds to, norms as well, like what is considered acceptable in society. And of course, it also responds to bargaining power, which group has the say on what types of technologies are developed, adapted, and deployed. So it is by no means an exogenous activity. And so one thing that we do say is that currently there's a lot of incentives that actually distort innovation in a way that incentivizes it to replace labor with capital. So, this could be happening, of course, absent incentives too, but currently there's a lot of policies that make labor very expensive and capital cheaper in many countries. And that will affect the incentives to want to innovate in things that will be able to substitute, capital for labor. So currently, there's already some distortion because of tax policy, for instance, and other policies that is probably pushing innovation in a much more labor replacing direction than would otherwise be the case. And so there is the possibility to think about technologies. We're currently seeing it with AI and other such technologies that are actually augmenting rather than replacing labor. They're making people more productive rather than just replacing jobs with automation. So there is no easy solution here, but it's important to recognize that current policies may be distorting the direction of innovation and to think about whether this is really something that we want. The fourth type of policy in this middle pillar is this idea of international economic policies that try to protect domestic labor and social standards, rather than having a race to the bottom. So currently, what is happening a lot in many countries is that because of international competition and because different countries have very different labor laws and labor protections, there is a tendency to have a little bit of a race to the bottom, which is basically one country, that is very competitive, in part because it has low labor standards, is able to sell at very low prices, which in a sense forces other countries to try and compete often by unfortunately also reducing domestic labor and social standards. So one thing that we encourage people to think about is, can we think about these social and labor standards a little bit like we think about trade policy overall? The World Trade Organization has standards on competition. It has, for instance, anti-dumping rules. Can we think about social anti-dumping? We're also already trying to do this a little bit with environmental aspects, right? Depending on how something was produced. So I think it's very important, we think it's very important to think about labor and social standards in this way as well. Unclear how far this could go, and it's obviously extremely tricky to outline, proper standards, etc., and to coordinate between countries. But it's not something that should be abandoned, unless we really want this race to the bottom across countries. Really, this is sort of the four types of policies here that we're thinking about in the middle pillar, and there's a lot of advantages to this approach we're also discussing. This is a little bit more abstract for sort of the big principles of this approach. So it's very much an approach that is structuralist. So it is trying to tackle the underlying, if you want, structural problems that are happening. Thinking about how should we organize production, how should we target innovation, etc. It's also something that tries to, not really think about, is this industrial policy? Is this really like the market versus the state versus regulation? It's very much an idea of a collaborative and iterative approach, given the big uncertainty, given the unknown aspects ahead that is required. And then it's very much thinking about merging the inequality and inclusion and economic growth agendas. Really, growth is going to be much reduced if we don't foster the dissemination of better technology throughout the economy instead of keeping it blocked in a few firms and sectors. I do want to say something as well about the third pillar, which is really, remember, this post-production stage. And there's many policies one can think of here, but let me focus on something that's, a bunch of things that are particularly salient and topical at the moment related to tax policy. So one thing that is super interesting and exciting at the moment is the progress that's made on tax cooperation across countries. So on one of the big aspects is on the taxation of capital. For a long time there was this idea that capital is so mobile across places, you really can't tax it. As soon as you try to tax capital, it's going to flow abroad. But there is actually now, policy action in a very coordinated way that is trying to resolve this issue to some extent. And one major improvement is in the automatic exchange of information. So while just, some years ago, the French, for instance, the French government wouldn't know, what bank accounts, someone had in the US, now they can know, someone who's a French resident for tax purposes has these accounts and these assets in the US. It's happening through an automatic exchange of information between the countries. On people, there's also an improved cooperation because people, some people like capital can be very mobile internationally. So especially this has been shown for higher income professionals that are not very attached to a location. And there have been over the years in many countries preferential tax regimes for foreigners that have appeared. Spain actually had this Beckham law to attract David Beckham, which was basically a tax cut for foreign high-income people. And these policies work in the sense that they do attract more high-income foreigners. That has been shown. But this is very much a beggar thy neighbor policy, which means, yes, that country attracts people, but it's at the expense of other countries. So it may be very much a zero-sum game. So this, again, is an idea that something will lead to a race to the bottom on taxation. And so there is a pushback against these regimes and more coordination, and that is a good thing, and that should be continued. Another sort of area for improvement in many countries, and this may sound, a little bit more, less perhaps, grand, but it is actually extremely important, is to reduce fiscal leakages by actually reducing tax avoidance and evasion. Governments are in need of revenues, and one part of the problem is not only the level of taxation, etc., but it's also the fact that there's a lot of fiscal leakages. A lot of tax money that should be collected is not actually collected. And one of the challenges is that there's things like private businesses and partnerships that are just very difficult to monitor and to know what is happening, as opposed to, say, standard employment relationships, which leave a lot of records for the tax administration. And here there's lots of great proposals, among others by Natasha Sarin and Larry Summers, on how to improve this. One idea is, for instance, to expand third-party reporting, which means, something is not just reported by you, the taxpayer, and that's it, but something is also reported by another entity. If you're an employee, that's typically your firm. If you have a bank account, your bank also reports that to the tax authority. To expand this, for instance, for private businesses and partnerships where banks, where the accounts are held, will also do some reporting. There's a lot of scope to leverage new tools in data analytics, like algorithms, machine learning, AI, to reduce non-compliance. There's a lot of info in tax returns, and researchers, like me, are working on it. And there's patterns that are very indicative of tax avoidance and evasion that the tax authority could very much leverage. But that does require resources, and these will be resources very well spent. Many tax administrations are a little bit starved for money and resources in terms of, upgrading their technology infrastructure, providing analytical capacities or staff training. And these are, this is money that is estimated to have a very high rate of return if it's invested in that. And then the final sort of policy in the third pillar is corporate and multinational taxation. Again, this is a very exciting area because a lot of progress has been made. And this is a very important issue, going back to this idea of what people think and what their attitudes are. There's a very clear sense in which, taxing multinationals and large companies is not only good for revenues, but people have a very strong fairness concern. There is very much a notion that in crisis, like, the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID-19 crisis, that companies are often, helped in bad times by governments, yet in good times, companies don't necessarily, pay enough into the common pool of funds that are needed. So there's very much a fairness issue at stake as well to get multinational taxation right. And luckily, a lot of progress has been made, led by the Global Tax Forum and the OECD, really centered around two pillars. They're called pillar 1 and 2. It's not the same as our pillars here in the matrix, but with initiatives basically to try and reduce profit shifting and base erosion by setting common rules, agreeing on, how is profit defined across countries, who gets to tax each share of it between a country where production happens, the country where sales happen. So it's complicated legislations, but it's really a great move forward. And then the second pillar, which is, you could call it a bit of a backstop, which is a bit of an emergency pillar of a minimum tax, which is, well, if the countries that should collect these taxes according to the rules are not doing it, the home country, sort of the resident country, is allowed to collect at least a minimum tax. So that actually sets a floor on how low taxes can go on multinationals. And this is a way to reduce a race to the bottom on corporate and multinational taxes. Especially if it's adopted, by a large country like the US or by blocks of countries, this is a way to stop that race to the bottom by putting a clear floor on corporate taxes. So these are really the sort of policy proposals, and hand in hand with this, goes a need to really continue to listen to citizens and understand their concerns as we try to, design better policies. And this is something that I'm doing a lot in my work on various economic policy issues at the Social Economics Lab at Harvard, where, we're trying to leverage large-scale surveys deployed in several countries, designed in sort of state-of-the-art methods to really try and elicit these invisible things like perceptions of people, their knowledge, their reasoning, their attitudes on various issues. And for policy, this is a very useful tool too, because it is a way to, of course, explore, understand, and learn, but also it's a way to sort of impact test in real time. It's a way to get feedback immediately when a reform is happening. It's a way to iteratively improve. It's a way to quickly evaluate policies and make changes if needed, or see what's working. So it's a tool that I think is extremely important, actually opened up by many new technologies like mobile technologies, and that I think is a very exciting area to think about, not only for research but also for policymakers. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. Let's move on to those questions. First of all, in the employment white paper, we placed a lot of emphasis on the production stage policies you and Roderick proposed to create better jobs for the middle class. So changes in industrial policies are involved in some of these, and we are particularly interested in your proposals for industrial regional policies. Could you please explain how you envision this type of action in a society like the Basque Country, where small companies dominate the economy and where some of those measures haven't been traditionally applied? How can we integrate them?
Yes. Now, this is a great question, and actually the report itself that we wrote offers a lot of examples from other countries, because countries do look very different in terms of their regional distribution, their sectoral distribution, and so it is something that has to be a little bit adapted. The core principles of this has to be done, in conjunction with governments and companies. This has to be a cooperative process. That is a very common thread throughout many countries, including this idea that companies need many things. They need infrastructures, they need qualified labor and workers, and governments need good jobs to be provided. So it is very much a quid pro quo here. It's actually very much feasible if there's many small companies in various places. In fact, it's perhaps even more valuable. So what happens often is that small companies are not able to incur the either investments at scale or the training costs, etc. And so for small companies, there's actually evidence that it's even more valuable to have this coordinated action, which actually means that they're going to be, cooperating with other small companies around and receive those infrastructure services, skill training services from the government. So it may be actually a great opportunity for both the creation of small firms and also, the survival and thriving of small firms, which typically, have a hard time incurring those big fixed investments that have to be done. Now, industrial policy per se, is a bit of a word that is not liked. And I think one thing that we try to emphasize here is industrial policy used to be something which was very top-down, directive. The government says this, these are the guidelines, and this is something that is not the goal here. The goal here is to have a much more, both bottom-up and top-down iterative approach. So perhaps there's another word needed for industrial policy, but I do think this is something that can work in many places.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your explanation. You mentioned sectorial training programs, and that prompted our attention because that could be an excellent tool for applying in the Basque Country. Could you please build on it a little more? How do they work? How is public
Yes.
and private participation articulated in those cases?
Yes, that's a great question. So the sectoral training programs that I showed you were very much sort of examples from the US. And in the US, these are typically done by community organization or private agencies. So these are not typically government-run programs. So our idea here was not to say this is how it should be. In fact, we're very much using this as an example of what governments can do, either national or local governments. But it's the functioning of it which is interesting, which is this idea that local employers typically, lack the sort of exactly the skills they need or the training that they need. And it is costly to think about people coming from elsewhere to fit those needs. It's possible, and that's basically what's currently happening. But there's local people who do not have the jobs and sort of local employers who need the jobs. And so the idea is to target the training that is done very much to the local sectors in need. So the example I gave was from the healthcare sector, where there's a lot of needs, especially with an aging population in many places, but a lack of qualified workers. And so the training is very much, asking firms, what are the skills you need? What is the training that we should be providing? And designing the curriculum with them. So making it very targeted to what is needed. In exchange, people know that when they enter this training, even though, typically it's free, but they could be paying something, they know that at the end of it, there is almost a guaranteed job because there is that need. Employers have committed to creating those positions. And they also know that they will be receiving a proper wage and proper working conditions, that they will be followed for several years by the organization or the private agency that did the training. And that, if something happens that is not great, that the employer does, the agency or the organization will step in to say, this is not the conditions, that we had agreed upon. This is not a high enough wage. These are not good working conditions. So there's an incentive on both ends, to behave well and to continue this cooperation, which is sort of mutually beneficial. Again, in the US, it's typically done by private agencies or community organizations. I mentioned the example of Google trying to do this sort of targeted training. So Google obviously being a very large private firm, but in other countries, it's just a template of the cooperation and of the targeting that is something useful to think about for national or local governments.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much, Stephanie Stantcheva, for your contribution. I hope this big round of applause will arrive to you as a sign of our gratitude. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.